Final Fantasy XI is a daunting game to get into, partially because of the complexity of the game itself, and also because the gameplay loop is so poorly explained. But as janky, opaque, and irritating as this game can be sometimes, it's equally as incredible and magical. So I'd like to explain what Modern 11 is like for anyone considering this game as their next Final Fantasy game or MMO. I'll break this video into chapters too, so you can search for topics you'd like more information on. The learning curve of this game can be a huge hurdle. There are tons of systems that greatly streamline the new player experience, yet the game never properly introduces these systems. Thankfully, the community has written 2 phenomenal guides for new players. If you're looking to get into the endgame, you'll find the Quick Start guide to be really helpful. While some aspects of the guide are a bit outdated, it's still incredibly helpful for finding your footing in the game. And if you're playing for the story, I recommend the Simple Mission Guide. It streamlines the playing experience so you have the least friction going through the story. Some people aren't too fond of written guides though, and that's fine. There are plenty of really helpful videos for new players that cover information far better than I ever could. If you're just getting started, I strongly recommend checking out Soberdorf's New Player Guide. This, in my opinion, is the golden standard for new player guides, and I could not recommend it enough. If you want to learn about getting through the sign-up process, picking your race, nation, or job, if you need more info on trusts, Unity Concord, or the basics of the game in general, this video will likely be the most helpful video you'll find. Because using a mouse to play this game is practically impossible, I also recommend either just using your keyboard or watching this video to help you set up your controller for the game. All the videos I recommend will be linked in the description, by the way. I also made several videos to help with the learning curve on this channel too. While Soberdorf's video is the best I've seen for new players, having extra resources never hurts. If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. The story for 11 is very important to the game. This isn't a bad thing either, because this game has one of the best video game stories ever told, in my opinion. 14's focus on an MMO story didn't come from nowhere. If this bothers you, there's no need to worry. The gameplay components of this game are just as robust as the story, but there is a lot of story to get through before you have full access to the most exciting gameplay systems, as they are unlocked through completing sections of the story. Just for clarification, the missions in 11 are the game's most important storylines, akin to MSQ in 14. The quests, on the other hand, are secondary storylines, which are often just as interesting as the main storylines, but they usually don't unlock as many gameplay systems as do the missions. What exactly constitutes the main story of 11? This will forever be a topic of debate, but the list on the screen right now tells you the overarching plot of 11. It starts in the base game, with the finale in the 6th expansion, Rhapsodies of Vana'diel. Here's a quick overview on all of 11's story content. You have 5 full expansions, 4 add-on storylines, 2 mini-expansions, one of which is the finale for the main plot, a ton of interesting quest lines, storylines for every job, and several other independent storylines tied to certain gameplay systems. While completing the main story will give you access to almost all of the relevant gameplay content, just about all of the supplemental storylines will give you access to certain content pieces too, even if that content is more niche. There are a few roadblocks that new players often run into when playing through 11's story, so let me address a few of them. One thing that often confuses people is just how to start missions. There are no quest markers or fancy menus that tell you where to go, what to do, or how much you've done. So to start a storyline, you just zone into a location, talk to the NPC, or complete the quest that starts the storyline. As mentioned earlier, there are plenty of online resources for story progression, so if you'd like more information on that, be sure to look up the missions guide linked in the description below. The order in which to play the expansions is often a cause for concern too. I made a whole video dedicated to this topic, so feel free to check that video out too if this is one of your concerns. The Limit Break quests, which unlock level 99, are very difficult quests, and most people try to power through these after defeating the Shadow Lord. The reason for this is because the first dramatic difficulty spike takes place after the Shadow Lord, where players need to be at least around level 80 to comfortably solo the story missions with trusts. The Limit Break quests are perfectly soloable with trusts, but if you have trouble with these, feel free to reach out to other players in the community, as there are always players who want to help newbies through the game. After achieving level 99, players may still have trouble soloing some of the later missions due to their lack of good gear. If you need to upgrade your gear, there are certain gear sets that can be acquired relatively easily. The easiest set is Baled gear, which can be purchased from these NPCs for Baled. If you need Baled, you can get it through trading copper vouchers. If you're still having trouble with those later missions, there are still stronger gear sets that you can get without too much commitment. I'll be going over these sets and how to get them in the Endgame section, so feel free to skip ahead to that chapter if that's what you're here for. Finally, if you're going through some of the early stories with good gear, and you're still getting demolished by random enemies in the game world, you're probably running into Apex mobs. These mobs are super high-leveled enemies, meant for grinding out job points or master levels, for players significantly stronger than you. These enemies are littered throughout certain earlier zones, and they can be easily avoided if you keep an eye out for them. Now, the mention of job points and master levels may have confused you. Isn't level 99 max level in 11? No, not even close. The discussion of job points and master levels brings us to the next topic that new players should probably be aware of. One common thing that I hear from new players is that they don't know how to get into Endgame. So here is a quick breakdown of what the modern gameplay path looks like for players getting into the Endgame, starting with, well, getting started. Of course, getting to level 99 is among the first steps. Along with this, you may also want to consider capping your relevant combat skills as well. You can do this by grinding those skills out, or by buying skill-up tomes from the Sparks vendors. If you decide to grind them out, be sure to switch your EXP mode to limit points so you can begin working on your merit points. While we're on the topic of early endgame, another thing you can be doing to prepare for endgame is to pay attention to the login campaigns. While I've seen many recommend this for mount collection, as it's the biggest source of mounts in the game, I actually recommend it for collecting alter egos or trusts. There are certain highly valuable quests you gain access to by acquiring a prerequisite number of trusts. These quests make your trusts stronger or give you access to even more powerful alter egos. There are plenty of other useful things you can get through the login points too, so it's definitely worth keeping up with. You acquire these points upon your first login each day, and once you have enough, you can spend them with these NPCs, and what they offer changes every month too. Before getting into actual endgame stuff, we need to first get some gear. Once you're level 99, you may find that your Baled gear isn't properly suiting your endgame needs. The next stepping stone tends to be Domain Invasion gear. You can purchase this gear from this NPC in Norg with domain points. How can you get domain points? You finish enough of Rhapsody's Vanadil missions to unlock Ryzenjima, and then you fight the dragons, which spawn in one of the 3 Eska zones. Dragons spawn in this order, and the next dragon will always spawn about 20 minutes after the previous one was killed. Kill enough of these dragons to collect enough domain points and start buying good gear from that vendor. The next gear set you can play towards is Ambuscade gear. You get this gear by participating in Ambuscade through this NPC. You can get the entry items by completing repeatable hunts. These entry items lets you take on an Ambuscade encounter. If you win, you can get points, and these points first let you buy the equipment and then upgrade that equipment. You can think about Domain Invasion gear as preparing you for the final bosses of the story and for Ambuscade. And then Ambuscade gear will prepare you for just about everything else. With this gear, you should be able to at least contribute to most groups unless they're taking on some of the more challenging content. Ambuscade gear will also set you up to gain merit points, job points, and master levels much faster too, so I suppose now's a good time to talk about the actual max level of Final Fantasy XI. Getting to level 99 is the first and fastest step in getting to max level. The second step is to grind out merit points and job points. Merit points can actually be earned starting at level 75, but I strongly recommend getting to level 99 before bothering with them. To finish Step 2 in your journey to max level, you need 2100 job points to master your job. Along the way, you'll gain the limit points needed to max out your merit points as well. This takes a long time to do, much longer than getting to level 99. But it is important that you work towards this step, even if you aren't rushing towards it outright. Despite how long Step 2 takes to complete, it's still nothing compared to the third and final step towards getting to max level. Once you master your job with 2100 job points, you are now at master level 0, and you begin earning exemplar points. To get to max level of Final Fantasy XI, which is master level 50, you'll need about 29.5 million exemplar points, a grind longer than both Step 1 and the enormous Step 2 combined. Thankfully, no relevant endgame content requires players to be at max level, so you don't have to force yourself through Step 3. Now that you have your ambuscade gear, and you're grinding through the leveling process, we can finally begin talking about the actual endgame of modern Final Fantasy XI. The most notable part about Final Fantasy XI's gearing process is probably the PREMAs. PREMA is an acronym that stands for Prime, Relic, Empyrean, Mythic, and Aeonic. These are the 5 ultimate weapon types in Final Fantasy XI, and each is quite a grind to get through. You don't need all 5 for your job. In most cases, a job primarily utilizes only 2 or 3 of these PREMAs. You can find out which PREMAs would most benefit your job by looking up job guides or by simply asking more experienced players on your server. I'll quickly provide an overview for the acquisition process of each. Relics and Mythics have similar acquisition quest lines, so I'll go over them at the same time. For Relics, you'll need to get a base weapon from Dynamis, farm some Dynamis currency and a few other items to complete the I-level 75 version of the weapon. And for Mythics, you want to head to Atargan and go through this quest line, which involves Assault, Salvage, Einherjar, the Zeni Notorious monster system, and several other pieces of content. Once you finish this questline, you'll have a completed I-level 75 version of a Mythic. After you get the I-level 75 version of your Relic or Mythic, you'll take this weapon through the Magian Trials, which are essentially a special set of hunts that have you fighting certain monsters in other forms of battle content. You'll do all of the Magian Trials associated with your weapon except for the last Magian Trial, as it's incredibly time-consuming and largely obsolete. This will leave you with an I-level 99 version of your weapon. By the way, Empyrean Weapons are both acquired and upgraded through the Magian Trials. Once you have a finished I-level 99 Relic, Mythic, or Empyrean, you'll take your weapon to the NPC Obro to finish upgrading it to its finished I-level 119 version. Aeonic Weapons are where things change quite a bit. For Aeonic Weapons, you need to kill every Gesh-Fet Notorious monster in the game. This can be really easy if you have a good group doing it with you, or really difficult if you don't. Along the way, you'll need to tackle several other combat content for Gesh-Fet NM spawn items, and you'll also need to farm currencies and items through Domain Invasion and Dynamis. The Aeonic weapon is completed at I-level 119, so once you get it, your weapon is done. Now, for all of the PREMAs discussed up until this point, there are augmentation options that can boost their power even further, and it's done primarily in Dynamis Divergence. The newest type of ultimate weapon is the Prime Weapon. Prime weapons are obtained through a combat content called Sortie, and that's it, you're done. Sortie is all you need for that. It is a ridiculous amount of Sortie that requires months of gameplay though. But in that content, you'll get everything you need, and once you finish that weapon, it will also be done at I-level 119 as well, without the need for upgrades. Next, we move on to the ultimate armor types in the game. For the sake of this video, I am going to discuss the Reforged armor sets as though they are the most important armor sets in the game. The most iconic armor sets that many players try to grind for in this game generally fall into 3 categories: the Artifact Armor, the Relic Armor, or the Empyrean Armor, and these make up the Reforged armor sets. Similar to the Ultimate Weapons, you need to acquire and finish the I-level 75 versions of these sets. and then participate in combat content to further upgrade them, or in this case, reforge them. One important piece of combat content in the Reforged quest lines is the high-tier battlefields. High-tier battlefields are amped-up versions of story fights that give extra rewards. These are similar to raid bosses in Final Fantasy XIV, and any group of new players working on gearing jobs will likely be doing a lot of high-tier battlefields. First of all, we have Artifact Armor, which is obtained through the job quests, the quests that tell your job's storylines. You do get a couple of free pieces through Deeds of Heroism too, which is a much easier way of obtaining them, but it's rather limited in how many pieces you can get. After getting the Artifact Armor, you can upgrade it through Limbus and reforge it through a combination of high-tier battlefields, Unity NMs, and Omen. Relic Armor pieces are dropped while you're in Dynamis, and you can upgrade the base set with Dynamis drops too. To reforge Relic Armor, you'll need to participate in several other forms of content, most notably Dynamis Diversions, the newest and most difficult version of Dynamis. The newest type of reforged armor is Empyrean Armor. You can acquire and finish this set through Abyssia content, and then reforge it with high-tier battlefields, Vagary, and Sortie. If you'd like more detailed video guides on the PREMA Weapons or the Reforged Armor sets, I've linked a playlist of really incredible videos in the description. The videos were made by a YouTuber named Cloudchief, and he makes the best videos on endgame gearing for Final Fantasy XI, so I strongly recommend checking his channel out. Now, any 11 veteran is no doubt fuming at me for one of two reasons. The first is how ridiculously simple my explanations for all of this content has been. I do admit, making these sets is far more intricate and involved than I'm making it out to be. But hopefully this is giving you an idea for the vast library of activities the game has for players interested in playing. 11 is an incredible journey for new players, and all of the different forms of content really facilitate this feeling. While it's true the current endgame of 11 encompasses a ton of different content pieces, there are a few cutting-edge pieces of combat content that the people who already have many of their Premas and Reforged sets are participating in. At the time of making this video, that would be Sortie, primarily for Prime weapons, as these are the newest types of ultimate weapons. Odyssey would be another cutting-edge piece of endgame content for its insanely great gear sets too.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Going down to the slightly less cutting edge, there are also tons of people still doing Dynamis Divergence for ultimate weapon augments and other contents, such as the occasional Omen and Geshvet. Soon, I expect that certain content like Limbus 3.0 and the new high-tier battlefields, which were recently announced, will be joining this list. Finally, there are the Master Trials, the hardest encounters that this game has to offer. These only reward aesthetic weapons, so there aren't as many people engaging with this, but there are still 2 races going on for the newest Master Trials that have yet to be cleared. Now, I've just mentioned what people are currently doing at the time of making this video, so this section of the video will likely age the worst, simply because the game is still getting new content. Beyond that, there are still players doing a ton more content other than this, because of the way the gearing in this game works. The second reason Final Fantasy XI veterans are fuming is because, while the weapons and armor that I've explained so far may be the flashiest and most iconic sets, they are far from the only desirable equipment pieces in the game. 11's gearing is incredibly horizontal, as opposed to Final Fantasy XIV's eye-level system. There are so many great gear pieces for so many different types of content that an exhaustive explanation would stretch on for hours. Another great thing about the horizontal gear progression in 11 is that every job's optimal gear sets contain gear pieces from unique content. This means that after you've done enough ambuscade to prepare for 11's endgame, your journey through 11's content will be dramatically different depending on what job you're playing. Gearing a Dark Knight will take players through the Relic and Empyrean content, while gearing a Blue Mage will eventually lead players to the Mythic content. White mages get incredible damage-dealing clubs from specific high-tier battlefields, while other jobs will take players to farming Unity or Geshvet NMs. If you want to be a blue mage in 11, you'll very much play as a blue mage. And if you want to be a puppet master, your journey is that of a puppet master's. While I've primarily talked about the gearing and combat content of 11, the game also has a ton of recreational content that results in interesting cosmetics, if that's the sort of thing you're into. There is chocobo breeding, chocobo raising, chocobo racing, if you're interested in certain coveted accessories. There is monster rearing, monster arenas, and limited monster classes. There is crafting, gathering, and island building. And all of this is only scratching the surface for all of the things the game has to offer after decades of updates. Regardless, gearing in this game is the activity that draws the vast majority of players. So before I wrap this video up, let's go over what you'll be using that gear for. Getting the best gear in the game won't help you at all if you don't know anything about the combat system, so let's go over the basics, starting with what you already know. To engage in combat, you select the enemy you want to target, and then select attack. Now whenever your character is in range, you'll do an auto attack every few seconds. Every auto attack generates tactical points, or TP. After getting a minimum of 1,000 tactical points, you can spend these points on weapon skills, which you unlock by leveling up your combat skill with said weapon. While there are a few exceptions, for the most part, using a weapon skill will deplete all of your tactical points, and the more points you have, the stronger your weapon skill will be. Now, before we move on to the more exciting things, let's get through some common hurdles. Many players find that they keep missing their auto attacks when they're fighting enemies. There are 3 things which can cause this. The first, you're too low leveled for the monster you're fighting. The second, your combat skill with the weapon you're using is too low. And finally the third, you just need better gear. Find out which combination of these issues are impacting you. But if the problem persists after correcting these issues, you should try using a support trust for the content that's giving you trouble. I've also heard from many players that the combat is too slow. If this is the issue you're experiencing, check and see if your job has any self-hasting job abilities, or try summoning support trusts that can cast haste on you. There is a possibility that your combat speed is slow because you don't have any haste at all going into battle. But if you're still leveling, or you haven't gotten any good gear yet, I'll be honest here. Combat will be slow early on. I assure you though, you need to be learning your job while the combat is slow, because when combat speed picks up at eye level 119, fights can be far more demanding. Alright, now for the fun stuff. If you're coming from Final Fantasy XIV, you'll likely be familiar with the term skill chain. In that game, a skill chain is just a combo of skills you're meant to do in your rotation to increase the damage of the skills or give them added effects. Skill chains exist in 11, but they work quite differently. Rather than being combinations of skills your character does, it's a combination of skills the party does. Unless you've geared for it, you cannot skill chain with yourself because your TP is used up after each weapon skill. Rather, you react to the weapon skills your party uses. If you use the appropriate weapon skill with the right timing after the previous weapon skill is used, you'll open a skill chain. While the skill chain is open, you can continue to use appropriate weapon skills to lengthen the skill chain and get massive bonus damage. You can see from this clip that even with just trusts, I was able to manage a respectable sized skill chain for a ton of extra damage. But how do I know which weapon skill to use and when? Well, the timing is the easy part. Just wait at least 1 second after the previous weapon skill was used, and the window lasts about 5 whole seconds. As far as which weapon skill to use, that's a different thing entirely. You have 2 options for knowing which weapon skill to use. Either use charts or calculators to memorize specific skill chain properties for your situation, or, well, use an add-on. I know the topic of add-ons can be controversial, primarily for players coming from 14, but 11 is a different game from 14. I'm not going to get into whether or not you should or shouldn't use third-party tools. All I'm going to say is that if you're going to use any third-party tools at all, it should probably be a skill chain add-on. Even if you decide to forgo the third-party tools though, you can still use charts and calculators as many others do to contribute to their party. Now, if you're playing a mage job, you may not be doing too much for the party through weapon skills, but mages have another important role while skill chains are open. Mages can perform magic bursts by casting offensive spells of the appropriate element while a skill chain is open. Magic bursts provide massive damage multipliers to the spells you cast, so if you coordinate with the physical damage dealers, you may become invaluable to your party. You can determine the appropriate elemental spell through the same methods for determining weapon skills. Let's address some common hurdles for people trying to learn how to skill chain or magic burst, and from now on I'll be referring to these two systems together as the skill burst system. The first is, how do I know if I properly contributed to the skill chain? Well, you'll get a fancy animation after your weapon skill, and the combat log will notify you, so keep your eyes peeled. A second common hurdle is parties that new players find themselves in just spam weapon skills too quickly for skill bursting to happen. This will likely be the most common hurdle you'll find yourself dealing with if you put together a party of players as opposed to playing with trusts, so let's discuss why this is so common. ZERGing, in the context of 11, means spamming weapon skills without regard for skill bursting. A big contributing factor for its popularity is the ambuscade weapons. While not all ambuscade weapons are created equal, most would agree that the good ambuscade weapons are incredibly effective at ZERGing, and not much else. They don't have the flexibility of the PREMAs, but they can keep up with the PREMAs in terms of ZERGing damage output, while being significantly easier to obtain. So rather than going through the trouble of putting together skill bursting strategies for many fights, players often just ZERG. So is skill chaining and magic bursting dead then? Is it a waste of time to engage with the game's mechanics? No, it's not, and do not believe anyone who would tell you as a new player otherwise. ZERGing is a very important part of combat, as is skill bursting. Both of them have their place, and from my experience as a new player getting into content with mediocre gear, skill chaining off of nagging zergs in a party got me way better numbers than ZERGing with my own strongest weapon skill. If you're playing with trusts with limited gear sets, believe me, skill bursting is the far more effective way of getting through older content, and it's made many impossible fights for me perfectly doable. Now that you understand skill bursting, I'll lightly touch on 11's job system. After reaching level 18 and completing a certain mission or quest, you utilize two different jobs from 11's catalog of 22 jobs. You set one job as your main job, and the second job as your sub-job. The level of your sub-job can be capped by three things. The first is how high you've leveled your sub-job independently. If this isn't an issue, then your sub-job will only ever be half the level as your main job. And the third thing is if you have some master levels under your belt. This will increase the level of your sub-job at a ratio of 5:1. By leveling up your jobs, you gain job abilities. Whatever jobs your character is set to, and what levels those jobs are, will determine the job abilities that you have access to. These job abilities usually offer buffs, debuffs, special attacks, and things of that sort. A common thing that keeps people from being effective in combat is simply not knowing what their job abilities do. So be sure to go through your job abilities and at least know what they do and when to use them. Here are a couple questions that frequently pop up about the game's job system. What's the difference between a basic job and an advanced job? Nothing at all. You don't need to unlock basic jobs like you do advanced jobs, so I guess that's a difference. But the distinction between basic jobs and advanced jobs is more confusing than it is helpful. Pretend like there is no distinction. Can I change jobs and support jobs at any time? Yes, you can. You have to level each one independently, but changing jobs is as simple as visiting your Mog house. Which jobs are currently in the meta? This question always bothers me, and here's why. Unless you're playing one of probably 4 or 5 different content pieces, the job meta doesn't really matter. While I wouldn't go as far as to say that the job balancing in this game is great, I will say that it's good enough for about 95% of the game's combat. And given how radically different each of the jobs play from each other, that is really good, all things considered. So new players don't have to worry about the meta. Interestingly enough, the very best players often don't worry about the meta either, because of the sheer complexity of the game's job system. Unlike Final Fantasy XIV, the gear in this game changes the way the job plays dramatically. With certain gear sets, Dark Knight as a glass cannon damage dealer could actually be a decent tank, for short periods anyway. Ninja can also be a tank with the Mog Bonanza weapon. There are some players who've recently shifted the meta for Summoner in some of the hardest content in the game, and thanks to the game's complexity, the meta is still constantly evolving. Due to the way the gear works in this game, 11's job system is an ocean whose depths we are far from having completely explored. Could the devs improve the game's job balancing? Absolutely they can. But as a new player, this shouldn't be too much of a concern for you. If you do want to ensure that you have a place in Endgame though, feel free to level either a healer or a support job, as those will always have a place in 11's Endgame. One last thing I'll touch on is gear swapping. Many new players hear about gear swapping in Final Fantasy XI and automatically assume that if they aren't gear swapping, they're somehow playing the game wrong. While this may be true once you start tackling more difficult content with multiple best-in-slot gear sets for different combat situations, you don't have to worry about this mechanic as a new player. And by the time you've gotten your Reforged sets, some Odyssey sets, and some shiny accessories, you'll have a pretty good idea then of what gear works best in each situation. If you want more information on gear swapping, check out the links I've included in the description below. Alright, despite how long this video has turned out, it's still barely scratching the surface of everything to know about Final Fantasy XI. Regardless, I hope that you found something in this video helpful. If you'd like more videos on getting into Endgame for Final Fantasy XI, I strongly recommend Basic Guardian's video for Final Fantasy XI Endgame. He goes over some of the same information included in this video, but he tends to focus on more actionable steps. The video is just a wonderful resource, and I really can't recommend it enough. I made this video in celebration of the Final Fantasy XI Days of Starlight event. A huge thanks to everyone behind that event who's coordinating everything. If you have any more questions, feel free to stop by the Final Fantasy XI subreddit, as the people over there are often very helpful. Or also feel free to ask them in the comments below. Thank you, dear viewer, for watching to the end.